Ball State Library of explication tapes. The following discussion of literature is one of a series made possible through a Lilly Endowment grant. The award was made by the Committee on Foundation Grants of the Association of College and Research Libraries, a division of the American Library Association. These grants are for the purpose of promoting more extensive and imaginative use of library resources by undergraduate students. Unless otherwise specified, the panelists are members of the English Department of Ball State Teachers College. 4 poems by A.E. Housman. Discussing these poems are Professor Gene Andrews, Professor Alfred Marks, and Professor David W. Shepard.
The Chestnut Casts His Flambeaux by A.E. Housman. The chestnut casts his flambeaux, and the flowers stream from the hawthorn on the wind away. The doors clap to, the pane is blind with showers. Pass me the can, lad, there's an end of May. There's one spoilt spring to scant our mortal lot, one season ruined of our little store. May will be fine next year, as like as not. Oh, aye, but then we shall be 24. We, for a certainty, are not the first have sat in taverns while the tempest hurled their hopeful plans to emptiness and cursed whatever brute and blackguard made the world. It is in truth iniquity on high to cheat our sentenced souls of aught they crave, and mar the merriment as you and I fare on our long fool's errand to the grave. Iniquity it is, but pass the can. My lad, no pair of kings our mothers bore. Our only portion is the estate of man. We want the moon, but we shall get no more. If here today the cloud of thunder lowers, tomorrow it will hie on far behests. The flesh will grieve on other bones than ours soon, and the soul will mourn in other breasts. The troubles of our proud and angry dust are from eternity, and shall not fail. Bear them we can, and if we can, we must. Shoulder the sky, my lad, and drink your ale. Professor Shepard, could you tell us what Housman means here in this opening line, the chestnut casts his flambeaux?
Well, this is a figure of speech that may pose some difficulty for those of us who are not familiar with chestnut trees. There's a torch-like blossom on the chestnut tree, and simply here the storm is stripping the tree of its blossoms. The same thing applies to the blossoms from the hawthorn. The violent wind and violent rain is wrecking the rather beautiful spring scenery.
And I think there's also the implication, is there not, that this is a kind of end of a torchlight procession. And as a torchlight procession very commonly symbolizes when the people cast their torches on the ground at the end of the torchlight procession, symbolize that time is passing and that we have come to the end of an era. Here, prematurely, the spring is ending. The flowers stream from the hawthorn, they stream from the chestnut, the wind is blowing, the doors clap to, doors are slamming outside, shutters are slamming, the pane is blind with showers, we can't see out of the window for the rain that is cascading down the window pane, and so the person says here, pass me the can, lad, there's an end of May. May is over, and he doesn't necessarily mean that this is May 30th. He means simply that the season of blossoms has come to an end. Pass me the can, now there's nothing to do but forget the difficulties of the world in pleasant inebriation.
In the second stanza, we see an attitude that I think is rather typical of Housman. Housman always looked back upon his youth with a great deal of nostalgia. He regarded this apparently as a period of joy and innocence. And in this particular poem, he imagines himself as being 24 again, and looks outside at the very bad weather that they're having during the spring, and thinks of how this particular spring has been ruined, and that a human being only has a fairly limited number of springs to enjoy during his lifetime. So that here Housman then observes that one season has been ruined of our little store. And in the last two lines of the stanza, he points out that although implicitly, I think, an optimist might point out that the following year will be very pleasant, perhaps, Housman reminds us that the following year will not be quite the same to him. Spring means different things to a man at different ages. And although his 24th spring might be very pleasant, his 23rd spring has been forever ruined. Just as we might imagine that if somehow or another a man's 21st birthday were ruined in some way, it would be of small comfort to him that he would have other birthdays, because a man's 21st birthday has a special significance for him. Now, Housman is not attaching any special significance to the 23rd spring any more than he attaches a special significance to every spring here, I think. And he says here that although there may be other pleasant springs in his life, one particular one, the spring of his 23rd year, has been lost forever, and there can never be another one exactly like it. In this next stanza, Dr. Shepard, we have a line that I think many people might interpret as being blasphemous. Do you agree that we have blasphemy in this next stanza where he refers to the Creator as a brute and blackguard?
Well, I think that the very literal interpretation, we do not have blasphemy in its usual sense, because he is attributing this to other people, though obviously he may be doing it too. He takes what comfort he can from the fact that, well, there are others who have spent a ruined day in a tavern, cursing the forces of nature, and, of course, cursed whatever brute and blackguard made the world. It borders on blasphemy, but I don't think we can say that at this point Housman is damning God. He's not doing that at all. As I say, he is on the border. This is pursued in the fourth stanza. It is in truth iniquity on high to cheat our sentenced souls of aught they crave. Now, this goes back to the 23rd spring, which you were just discussing. A sense of, impetuous youth here, frustrated by something he cannot control. The important thing is the spring that I'm in at the moment. And he apparently distrusts the future with good reason, because, all right, next spring may be beautiful, but look what happened to this one. All right, we take it without saying anything. Next spring comes and it's ruined. But he is showing considerable concern here for the present. Note the last two lines of the fourth stanza. And mar the merriment as you and I fare on our long fool's errand to the grave. Some more of Housman's cynicism or pessimism.
Yes, I think that here we've got to keep in mind that the poem is a dramatic poem, and that Housman has become a character in his own poem. These phrases, which might ordinarily be regarded as blasphemous, I think we have to make allowances for when we consider that they are uttered in a particular dramatic situation, namely that a man is kept indoors by the pouring rain outside. He's frustrated, and without thinking of the deity as a personal sort of God at all, he says anyone who is responsible for this terrible weather is a wicked person, because it is in truth wickedness to cheat us of the few pleasures in life that we might enjoy.
There is, however, the merriment as you and I hear in that end of that fourth stanza that might give us the possibility of saying here that it is Housman talking, but it is simply a small ray of light that we can seize on or not. He continues in 5. He repeats the word iniquity. Iniquity it is. It's iniquity the way in which God seems to treat us here on earth. But pass the can, let us forget about it again in drink. Then he uses an allusion, or I suppose we'd call it a rather concealed image in the next 2 lines, where he says, "My lad, no pair of kings our mothers bore. Our only portion is the estate of man." And portion is used here quite advisedly to mean inheritance. We are not kings, therefore we don't inherit what kings do. All we get for our estate is what any man gets, any common man. We want the moon. We would like to inherit more than this when we are brought into the world, but we shall get no more than that portion which any mother gives to any child of man.
Yes, and I think that in stanza 6, we have an implication, at least, of what this portion of man is. Don't you think so, Dr. Shepard?
I think so, and I think the portion a man gets is misery. And again, Housman takes what comfort he can in the fact that others will be miserable, that if we have a thunderstorm here today ruining the fine weather, we can be quite sure that someone else's merry month of May will be completely spoiled somewhere else. But he states it in other terms: the flesh will grieve on other bones than ours, and the soul will mourn on other breasts. So he moves it, I suppose, to a philosophical plane, if it can be called that.
Or anatomical.
Anatomical, but still has certain theological overtones here. When he talks about flesh, bones, and the soul mourning in other breasts. He's out of the tavern at this point.
Yes, I think that also he implies here that that life consists of both good or pleasantness and evil or discomfort. That tomorrow we may be having a better time here, the weather may be more pleasant here, someone else will be miserable. That is, life consists of a series of alternating pleasant experiences and miserable experiences.
Well, I think the 7th stanza, as well as the 6th, perhaps takes us back to Terence. Life consists of ill and good, though far much more of the ill than of the good. So brace yourselves for the worst. And if you're conditioned to evil and to misfortunes, then you will be able to survive. Our troubles, the troubles of our proud and angry dust, are from eternity and shall not fail. This is forever. There's no point in looking for the good life on this earth.
Yes, we can also consider this as a further explanation of stanza 6. In stanza 6, the implication is that life consists of both good and evil, and in stanza 7, he brings out, as you've suggested, this idea that we find in Terence, This Is Stupid Stuff, that the one thing that we can count on in this life, however, is trouble, and that we can expect trouble, and I think the implication is that we should accept our troubles philosophically, endure them, and do the best we can with them.
And the words from eternity also go back to the words a state of man in stanza 5. These troubles are from eternity, meaning that man has always had these difficulties, and in a sense also they are given us by the Almighty.
Yes, there's an interesting little pun in the last two lines, bear them we can, and if we can, we must. This, I think, takes us back to the last line in stanza 1, for instance, pass me the can, lad. That is, he's punning upon the cannikin, the container used for drinking beer or ale. Bear them we can, and if we can, we must. That is, mankind is so constituted that we are able to endure our troubles, and inasmuch as we are able to endure these troubles, we have no choice but to accept them and to try to live with them. Shoulder the sky, my lad, and drink your ale. I think Housman here is counseling us to accept our troubles philosophically, to try to endure them, and to live in this life with a minimum of discomfort again. The Carpenter's Son. Here the hangman stops his cart. Now the best of friends must part. Fare you well, for ill fare I. Live, lads, and I will die. Oh, at home had I but stayed, apprenticed to my father's trade. Had I stuck to plane and ads, I had not been lost, my lads. Then I might have built, perhaps, gallows trees for other chaps, never dangled on my own, had I but left ill alone. Now, you see, they hang me high, and the people passing by stop to shake their fists and curse, so 'tis come from ill to worse. Here hang I, and right and left 2 poor fellows hang for theft. All the same's the luck we prove, though the midmost hangs for love. Comrades all that stand and gaze, walk henceforth in other ways. See my neck, and save your own. Comrades all, leave ill alone. Make some day a decent end, shrewder fellows than your friend. Fare you well, for ill fare I. Live, lads, and I will die.
Now this poem utilizes a technique that's rather familiar in modern poetry, not so common in 19th century poetry, even late 19th century poetry, which this is. It sets up at least 2 different levels of interpretation. It can be read on the one hand on a surface level, which is fairly easy and which reveals itself fairly immediately, and a second level which is much deeper and at the same time has a number of complications in it that may bring about various interpretations. First, then, the story is simply that of a carpenter's son who grew up, left his father's trade, went, we don't know quite where, perhaps to the city, and then committed some crime for which he got himself hanged. Now, the crime we are not sure of, but it seems as if on this first level was something that had to do with women and that had to do with love. The poem, then, on its surface level, is a quotation from the mouth of the carpenter's son, who is about to be hanged. He tells us in the first stanza that the hangman is stopping his cart, and he stands in the cart or beside the cart, or tumbrel, as those of us familiar with the French Revolution might call it, and lectures them as to the meaning of his death. The meaning in the second stanza is that it would have been well had he stayed with his father, had he continued working at his trade. The third stanza says that if he had stayed with his father, he would not now be about to be hanged. And in the fourth stanza, he shows how he has become an object of derision and even of invective as he stands here and as he will soon be on the gallows. Then in stanza 5, he mentions the fact that although here to some extent he seems to be actually hanging, and his message is given while he is hanging from the gallows, and he mentions that on each side of him are two other men who are hanged because they stole something. He, however, he reminds us here, or tells us here, died for love. In the next stanza, he said to his friends, "Look upon me and see my neck, and save your own neck by seeing the thing that I have done, and by avoiding, if you can, the kind of fate to which I have come. Be shrewd, and be shrewder than I, and make someday a decent end, and then live through and by my death."
On the second level, however, I think we see that the protagonist of this poem bears a rather striking resemblance to a well-known historical and theological figure. That is, first of all, the very title itself informs us that this man is the son of a carpenter, a son who, however, did not follow his father's trade, but who went on to lead a different sort of life. We see that this carpenter's son has done something for which he is being punished. He's being punished by hanging. The fact that on his right and on his left, two thieves are being hanged also begins to point out quite clearly, I think, that this person is one who is suffering much the same fate that Christ suffered. He's hanging between two thieves, and the people are walking by and cursing him. And finally, in a sense, the advice that he gives to his companions is also Christ-like in one sense. That is, he tells them to leave ill alone. This is a line, however, that I think is subject to other interpretations also. Perhaps, Professor Shepard, you could tell us how you think this advice that the carpenter gives to his companions should be interpreted.
Well, I think that the advice here is a startling departure from traditional Christian theology. That is, if we assume that this is the Christ myth running through this poem. If this were traditional Christian theology, the carpenter's son would say, go out and reform the world even though I die for it. That it's the afterlife that will count. There's no reference here to an afterlife And the advice in the last stanza is this: don't tamper with the world as it is. Leave it alone. Go your way. Don't pay any attention to your neighbor. But above all, don't try to reform the world, because if you do, you can see what will happen. You'll be hanged. So that in this poem, I think Housman presents the carpenter's son on two levels. First, the reformer, with no metaphysical or no spiritual overtones. And second is perhaps a cynical view of Christ, that he sees things rather pointless altogether.
Yes, as I see it, this is an attempt at a reinterpretation of the Christ figure. Clearly enough, the carpenter's son is not Christ himself, but he's someone who has had an experience that is remarkably similar to that of Christ. I think that it's significant that instead of calling this poem the Son of God, Housman has entitled it The Carpenter's Son. That is, I think that we are to view Christ here in his capacity as a human being, and we are to analyze his experience as the experience of a human being. And that what Housman is saying, in effect, is that a person who sets out to govern his life on the principle of brotherly love, who attempts to reform the world and to make of it a world of love, is one who is destined to come to a bad end in the eyes of the world. That is, he will be whipped with the world's displeasure. The world will not reward him for his altruistic behavior, but rather will punish him for his efforts to correct the evil in the world.
Well, I think there are two other things that might be noted. First, that the spiritual overtone is removed. There's nothing of the supernatural here. If we go back to the crucifixion, we find first, Christ did not address the crowd. His last words were, "Oh my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" Something of that nature. Not so here. We have the man about to be hanged preaching a sermon, but with what we might say rather a reverse twist to it. He's not telling people to be good, he's telling them to mind their own business.
Yes, well, I'd like to add and perhaps subtract something from those points you made, Mr. Shepard. First of all, the carpenter's son seems to be alive in the first three stanzas of the poem. After that, he seems to be speaking while he is dead. Therefore, perhaps he doesn't really speak words in the first three stanzas, and perhaps his actions are speaking the words of this particular poem. In addition to that, we have the problem as to what he is saying. Now, if he is saying, "See my neck and save your own," he is giving a very shallow counsel. He is simply saying here something like, "He who lives and runs, or he who fights and runs away will live to fight another day, and he who is in battle slain will never live to fight again." He is implying that people should keep out of trouble and leave ill alone. And in addition to that, since we are playing with the word love and the word ill in this second level, he should also not be so guilty as to do anything for love of man, and when it comes to any evil that has been committed in the world, he should not attempt to set it right, because evil is something that will blacken you and that will kill you if you try to do anything about it. I think that a deeper meaning lies here than simply that shallow counsel, as I have called it. I think that the man who is being hanged is speaking with irony, and that he is saying, as he does in the last stanza with the word shrewd, that whereas the shrewd fellows in the world, those who are after their own concerns, will take care of their own concerns and do nothing for their fellow men and for the world and for the good of the world, the men like the carpenter's son will still die for what they believe in, even though from everything that seems to be proper and good on the surface, it might be well for them to stay away from the difficulties of the world.
Well, if this irony is indeed in the poem, it's a very subtle irony, and I wonder if it isn't a weakness in the poem to reserve that irony for the very last stanza or two. The thing that raises doubts in my mind is the diction of the poem. The word hang, repeated throughout, dangled, gallows trees, chaps, it's all on a very pedestrian level, a very common level. And there's a possibility here that the irony is that the true believer, the reformer, who is being hanged, is a pretty shoddy sort of person. Perhaps the irony goes in a different direction than you interpret it.
My point is that if we take this on its easiest second-level interpretation, that he is quite shoddy, and that if we want to make him as something better, and perhaps if we want to make him as something, if not Christ-like, at least similar to the human Christ, we must say that the irony does show him saying something better and something deeper.
I wonder about this theory of irony. When the carpenter's son tells his companions, walk henceforth in other ways, it seems to me that he is actually giving them some good practical advice. And I find that the advice the carpenter's son gives his companions is fairly consistent with Housman's attitude toward troubles and evil throughout the Shropshire Lad and in last poems also. That is, Housman views this world as being, to put it mildly, an imperfect world in which man is afflicted with all kinds of troubles. He regards it as a world in which a great deal of evil exists, and it seems to me that Housman's basic philosophy is that man should not try to change the world, but should learn how to accommodate himself so that he is able to live in this imperfect world. You recall, again, the moral to Terence, this is stupid stuff. There are troubles in the world, and there's not very much that we can do about these troubles except to accommodate ourselves to them. Here, of course, I don't deny that there's irony here. When the carpenter's son says that he is hanging for love, clearly enough, the comparison with the Christ figure is rather ironical. Christ was hanging for love of mankind. This carpenter's son, who appears to be a 19th century carpenter's son, is hanging because he got into trouble as the result of a love affair with a woman, apparently. Again, I think that there's irony here in the meaning of leave ill alone. On one level, the 19th century carpenter appears to be telling his comrades to avoid the ways of evil. When we try to interpret this as the speech of a Christ figure, however, the advice seems to me to mean that one should not tamper with evil, because clearly enough, the Christ figure, Christ himself, was not a person who followed an evil course of action. His mistake was simply in trying to change the evil nature of man. So that actually, it seems to me that this poem works in an interesting fashion. Instead of the Christ figure changing our opinion of the carpenter, exactly the opposite happens. That is, the carpenter's dilemma sheds new light upon the Christ story and leads us to reinterpret the Christ story itself.
Well, I would think I will add this, that I think that had I but left ill alone can be interpreted in only one way. That is that the carpenter's son is attempting to correct the evil that he sees. In that sense, he's not going out and following a riotous existence or anything like that. In this sense, he is trying to reform the world. He's trying to do something about evil.
You mean the Christ is?
The carpenter's son is the one who is trying to correct evil. And this is what he gets for his thanks.
I would like to just conclude our reading of the poem on this note, that it seems to be true here that Housman has hung us up on the two horns that he very frequently sets up to hang his poems on. On the one hand, he is extremely pessimistic about the world and tells how the world is a difficult place and how, if one is wise in the world, he will avoid the difficulties of the world and prepare himself to bear them, but will not take any more of them upon his shoulders than is absolutely necessary. On the other hand, he shows a strong admiration for the man who goes out and gets himself killed for a principle. I don't know that he gives us the answer as to whether he is on either horn here in the poem. Suffice it to say that the poem leads to at least two interpretations, and perhaps to the central paradox at the core of Christian belief.
4 poems by A.E. Housman. Discussing these poems are Professor Gene Andrews, Professor Alfred Marks, and Professor David W. Shepard.
Could man be drunk forever? Could man be drunk forever with liquor, love, or fights? Lief should I rouse at morning, and lief lie down of nights. But men at whiles are sober, and think by fits and starts. And if they think, they fasten their hands upon their hearts. Dr. Marks, what do you think Housman is counseling us to do here? Is he recommending drunkenness as a means of escape from our troubles?
Well, in the first two lines, he is stating the possibility that men might find drunkenness in various pursuits. First, naturally, they can become drunk with liquor. Second, they can become drunk with love, and I think we know of more than one case of a person who has been driven out of his head by love. And third, by fights. I don't know whether we know of many people who enjoy fighting, who love to fight, who become consumed by the joy of fighting. This kind of person we would perhaps think of as being the same kind of person who would be rather free with his liquor and who might also attempt to be rather free with women if he were able. This kind of brawling nature, however, Housman is implying all men have, and all men would desire this kind of drunkenness.
Then you think that what he is doing here is using this image of drunkenness on alcohol as the basis for his whole poem, although he actually means by drunkenness simply the act of becoming so intensely engaged or occupied in some activity that he loses himself. Is that correct?
Yes.
In this stanza, then, what Housman has said is that if it were possible for a man to become so occupied with some activity, whether it's drinking, whether it's a love affair, possibly a military battle, or perhaps even on a simpler level, just a conflict of personalities of some sort, if he could become so engaged in such an activity, he says that he would gladly get up in the morning and gladly would lie down at night.
Seems to me that we have a picture here, not of the good life, perhaps, but at least a picture of the life Housman would like to lead, or the world he can get along with. And we'll notice that in the beginning of the second stanza, the first two lines, but, that is an important but. Men at whiles are sober and think by fits and starts. Man does not stay drunk forever. He, with liquor or love or anything else, he spoils everything by thinking.
Yes, I think this is clearly what he's saying, that although being drunk forever would furnish one means of escape from our troubles, perhaps, that inevitably there comes an end to drunkenness, whether it is a drunkenness on alcohol, or whether it's a love affair, or whether it is a conflict. And when he does sober up, he discovers that he thinks.
I think the problem arises with the last two lines of the poem. The first 6 lines are perfectly understandable, but this other passage, and if they think, they fasten their hands upon their hearts. Now, what does this bring up, Dr. Marks?
Well, this brings up the fact that life for men, as Housman sees it, Housman, we can say, is a pessimist, is a difficult one. Life is hard on men, and it would be very nice if they could escape it by being drunk in the various ways that they like to get drunk. But, they must think once in a while, and Housman is implying it is very difficult for a man to think seriously about the world without becoming very sad.
Is there the possibility that Housman is saying that the thing that makes the world an unpleasant place in which to live is the fact that men think?
Or that men have to think, yes.
Men have to think.
Yes, I think the implication here is that this world that we live in is a dim, dark vale of tears, and that in order to survive with a minimum of pain, it is necessary for us to forget about our true surroundings and become so intensely occupied with some sort of activity that we don't have time to think. And although this drunkenness that Housman considers in the first stanza as a possible means of escape works part of the time, here in the last 2 lines, and if they think, they fasten their hands upon their hearts, he's saying, I think quite clearly, that eventually man has to sober up to face the philosophical truths of his own existence, and that such meditation about his own situation in this world leads to sadness. That is, the image of the hand upon the heart, I think, is a gesture of indicating pain in this poem. Epilogue. Terence, this is stupid stuff. You eat your victuals fast enough. There can't be much amiss, 'tis clear, to see the rate you drank your beer. But, oh, good Lord, the verse you make, it gives a chap the bellyache. The cow, the old cow, she is dead. It sleeps well, the horned head. We, poor lads, 'tis our turn now to hear such tunes as kill the cow. Pretty friendship 'tis to rhyme your friends to death before their time, moping melancholy mad. Come, pipe a tune to dance to, lad. You'll notice that the first stanza of this poem is in quotation marks. Perhaps, Dr. Shepard, you could tell us who seems to be speaking in this opening stanza, and to whom is he speaking?
The speaker is addressing his remarks to Terence. Terence is the poet, presumably Housman. The speaker, a critic, not a critic in the literary sense, but I mean he's one of the boys in the pub, and begins his observation by noting that, well, Housman, you're nothing's wrong with your appetite, nothing's wrong with your thirst. Apparently there can't be too much wrong with the world. Apparently it's an opening attack on Housman's pessimism, or perhaps at the worst his cynicism.
Yes, he's very obviously critical of the poetry that he's been reading, for he says, "Oh, good Lord, the verse you make, it gives a chap the bellyache." Perhaps, Dr. Marks, you could explain this next passage of the cow, the old cow, she is dead. It sleeps well, the horned head. This doesn't seem to fit in very well with the context of the poem.
These lines are a kind of burlesque on the kind of poem that Terence likes to compose. We might even reread the lines in this way: the cow, the old cow, she is dead. It sleeps well, the horned head. A kind of melodramatic burlesque of the kind of unfortunate, sad, sentimental, maudlin poem that his friends here seem to think that Terence is guilty of composing. The lines following it: "We poor lads, 'tis our turn now to hear such tunes as killed the cow," bring back to me an expression that was used when I was a very small boy, and it applied to anyone who was singing or playing on an instrument any tune that was very far from being tuneful. The expression always used was that it was the tune the cow died on. And here the implication is, I think the same expression lies behind the statement, "Here, 'tis our turn now to hear such tunes as killed the cow," meaning the poems that you are composing for us are very sufficient to have killed the cow had she not been dead when you wrote about her.
Notice that the drinking companion, the critic, apparently does not take Housman's poetry seriously at all to produce this little burlesque. At the same time, the critic is voicing what amounts to a popular conception of what poetry ought to be. It ought to be cheerful, it ought to be inspiring, perhaps edifying, but if nothing else, at least cheerful. It's the type of demand we get for the newspaper poet, that type of thing.
And as he says in the last line, something we can dance to. It is very interesting nowadays to listen to Steve Allen, for instance. About every other week on his program, he introduces a few lines from modern song lyrics and mentions, again, rather over-dramatically, that the men who usually, or who would under normal circumstances write poetry, are now writing song lyrics. He doesn't mean it at all, of course. And then he reads a few very strange, very maudlin song lyrics. However, this friend of Housman's seems to feel that the poet would be much better off were he writing popular songs.
Yes, of course, in the concluding line to this stanza, I think we have what amounts to a tongue-in-cheek pastoral allusion. Whenever we find a poet talking about piping a tune, he is, as a rule, not referring to the playing of a musical instrument at all, but is referring to the pastoral conceit which regards the creation of poetry, or compares the creation of poetry to the piping of a tune by a shepherd.
Yes, the general pastoral tradition, sometimes called the pagan tradition, at other times called the Arcadian tradition, sometimes also referred to as bucolic, the kind of world in which Pan is the king and in which we have satyrs and nymphs and fauns and dryads and hamadryads all dancing about madly, is the kind of world that this man perhaps would just as soon live in, the joyful world which is not governed at all by modern convention and modern law and even modern concepts of religion.
In the first stanza, then, we hear one opinion of Terence's poetry. His friend objects to the poetry that he has read, principally because he believes it to be excessively melancholy, much too sad. In the next stanza, however, we see Terence's answer in which he defends his poetry.
Why, if 'tis dancing you would be, there's brisker pipes than poetry. Say, for what were hop yards meant, or why was Burton built on Trent? Oh, many a peer of England brews livelier liquor than the Muse, and malt does more than Milton can to justify God's ways to man. Ale, man, ale's the stuff to drink for fellows whom it hurts to think. Look into the pewter pot to see the world as the world's not, and faith, 'tis pleasant till 'tis past. The mischief is that 'twill not last. Oh, I have been to Ludlow Fair and left my necktie God knows where, and carried halfway home or near pints and quarts of Ludlow beer. Then the world seemed none so bad, and I myself a sterling lad. And down in lovely muck I've lain, happy till I woke again. Then I saw the morning sky. Hi-ho, the tale was all a lie. The world, it was the old world yet. I was I, my things were wet, and nothing now remained to do but begin the game anew.
Here we see the poet launching an attack on the critic. He's saying that if you want something that would cheer you up, then don't look for it in my poetry. You find more potent things, more cheerful things in the village pub, but don't come to my poetry for it. Of course, we get the references to the hop yards, Burton built on Trent, obviously a brewery. And in the second line, there's brisker pipes than poetry. I think we have a pun here, the pipe of ale. At the same time, a reference to the pipe of Pan, which is referred to in the first stanza.
The pipe is a term. Now, I've forgotten how many gallons there are in the pipe. Perhaps even as many as a few hundred gallons. I've forgotten, but it is a tremendous barrel which is used, I think, most commonly for wine, but could also be used for ale or beer, I suppose.
Yes, in the line, "and malt does more than Milton can to justify God's ways to man," I think we have a reference to an idea that we've previously encountered in Could Man Be Drunk Forever? That is, if one's purpose in life is to live with a minimum of pain, drunkenness, the drinking of beer or ale, is much more effective in letting man forget his troubles than poetry, even poetry of the very best sort. Of course, we have here a sort of paraphrase of Milton's avowed purpose in Paradise Lost to justify God's ways to man. And Housman, or Terence, is here saying that getting drunk is much more effective than reading poetry if one's purpose is to live in this world with reasonable happiness.
Notice there are two lines here which refer to the first poem we read. Ale man, ale's the stuff to drink for fellows whom it hurts to think. For the men who fasten their hands upon their hearts, they can take refuge in drunkenness. Look into the pewter pot to see the world as the world's not. Well, certainly we got a philosophy of poetry here, if we can use that heroic term, that the poet is saying, it's my job to describe the world as it is, not as you wish it might be. He's not, in other words, Housman is saying, if you want escapism, don't come to me. Go to the village bar or go to Hollywood.
There is also the implication that when a person is looking into the pewter pot, into the stein or the ale mug or the can, as Housman calls it elsewhere, that one sees the bottom of the mug, of course, and not the world, and at the same time, while one has the pot of ale to his lips and is drinking from it, his eyes become considerably bleared from not so much what he's looking at as what his mouth is taking into it while he is looking at it. And as a result, the world becomes greatly different.
I think also it might not be amiss to remember that in the previous poem that we discussed, Could Man Be Drunk Forever?, Housman uses this same image of drunkenness, although we saw in that poem that he thought that there might be several different types of drunkenness other than drunkenness on liquor or beer. And although here he uses exactly the same image, I think perhaps we should keep in mind that perhaps the same observations apply to drunkenness on love and drunkenness on fights.
I think the poet turns a very neat trick on his critic. Critic is saying, I want the world described in pleasant terms. Housman says, all right, very well, take to ale. And then Housman proceeds to describe the circumstances in which the world appears pleasant to the drunkard. Well, he doesn't know where he left his necktie, being carried home. He rolls in the mud. He wakes up with a hangover. He gives a rather sordid description of the drunkard, and he applies it to the man, perhaps not especially the drunkard, but the man who wants to deceive himself, the man who wants to see the world as, well, everything's well with the world, and every day and every way I'm getting better and better. Let's have positive thoughts. Let's be encouraging, even though it isn't true.
And in the words of Ludlow Fair, we have the reminder that this is an older England, perhaps even than that England that A.E. Housman lived in, that is being talked about. It is helpful to remember this in noticing that Housman writes in a kind of ballad rhythm. His work is very similar to the ballad which most of us are familiar with in the form of poems that are composed by word of mouth, that are somewhat jingly, that have rhymes in them that are fairly straightforward, although not all lines do rhyme, and that tell about the needs and desires of common people. Here we have the kind of lad who would live in the country and who would only know joy and dancing and drinking as these things were to be found at the fair somewhat distant from his farm home.
I think it's interesting that in these first two stanzas, actually we have simply a much fuller development of the idea that we've already encountered in Could Man Be Drunk Forever? He tells us that the trouble with taking to drink as a means of escape is, in his own words, the mischief is that 'twill not last, that although it might be very pleasant to forget about our troubles by going to Ludlow Fair, drinking, carrying quarts and pints of Ludlow beer home with us, lying down in lovely muck, he reminds us that when we do awaken, we will see the morning sky. In Housman's words, "Hi-ho, the tale was all a lie. The world, it was the old world yet. I was I, my things were wet." That is, he's reminding us, as he did in Could Man Be Drunk Forever, that we can't stay drunk forever, that we have to sober up sometime, and that when we do sober up, we have the same problems that were facing us before our drunken spree began.
Now the next stanza presents a kind of didactic, moralizing statement on the problem that is expressed in the earlier two stanzas. Terence, continuing, says, "Therefore, since the world has still much good, but much less good than ill, and while the sun and moon endure, luck's a chance, but trouble's sure, I'd face it as a wise man would, and train for ill, and not for good. 'Tis true the stuff I bring for sale is not so brisk a brew as ale. Out of a stem that scored the hand I wrung it in a weary land. But take it. If the smack is sour, the better for the embittered hour. It should do good to heart and head when your soul is in my soul's stead, and I will friend you, if I may, in the dark and cloudy day."
In this stanza, then, Housman begins to give us the solution to the problem which he has posed in the first two stanzas, a problem which was the subject of Could Man Be Drunk Forever? That is, if drunkenness, then, is not a satisfactory solution to our troubles, what is? And here Housman says that the only lasting solution to our problem is to face the fact, realistically, that the world that we live in is not perfect, and that although there is a chance that we might have good luck, the one thing that we can count on for sure is trouble. And therefore Housman says we should realistically face this fact and prepare for trouble, since we know that it is the one inevitable thing that we can expect in this life.
There's one section here that might give someone some trouble. "Out of a stem that scored the hand, I wrung it in a weary land." What is he bringing in there?
This is a very interesting statement, which is one of my favorites for an expression by the poet of his definition of poetry and what the act of poetic creation is. He is talking, remember, in this about the problem of distilling ale and drinking ale and beer. Here, he compares the act of creation by the poet as a kind of pressing process, like that of pressing grapes or grain for beer. However, here he wrings the stem that is the stem of life, with his hands. It's a thorny stem, the stem of life, and it cuts his hands. Life is extremely painful to Housman, remember, and in going through life and in living life and experiencing life, he goes through a great deal of pain, and the implication is that he is going through this pain on the behalf of his readers. The implication is almost that Housman stays sober in order that he will best experience life so that he can best pass on his lessons in it to his readers. Out of a stem that scored the hand, I wrung it in a weary land. The weary land, the weary world about him, which knows so much trouble, but here he is busy pressing the distillation of poetry, the harsh, bitter distillation of poetry, out of the thorny stem of life.
In a word, then, the stem out of which Housman is pressing this stuff which he has to offer is the stem of experience, isn't it?
Yes.
The stem of experience which, according to the cliche, is a good teacher, but which is a very severe teacher and which will leave its marks on one who attends that school.
It is interesting to notice in the line, "But take it, if the smack is sour," that again he uses a somewhat old word, a somewhat archaic word. This goes along with his ballad form and with his habit of writing for, or writing as if he were a member of a society of an older day. We had in Could Man Be Drunk Forever the word leaf used, which is still around to some extent in our language as just as leaf, but which many of us perhaps think should really be just as leave. Here, the word smack, which perhaps some of us know from the German as the word schmeck, meaning taste, here it becomes smack.
Well, exactly what is it that he is offering to us, which he says has a sour smack?
Well, I think he's going to tell the truth. He's describing the world as it is, not as the world is not. And he said, he's saying the world is not a pleasant place to live in. Of course, at that point we can quarrel with his description. He's simply saying that my description of the world matches the world as it is.
Then, in effect, what he is offering to us is his poetry, which he says may not be the most cheerful poetry in the world. It may have a sour taste to it, but nevertheless, it will prepare you for the troubles which you will inevitably meet with in your life. And in this way, Housman then is saying that this poetry will do good to your heart and head when your soul is in my soul's stead. That is, Housman has learned these bitter lessons through experience, and he is offering the reader this poetry, which he says will comfort him when the reader's troubles pour down upon him.
The last stanza now is a kind of parable, exemplifying the words spoken in the third stanza, which read, "I'd face it as a wise man would, and train for ill and not for good." And now we have the story of the man Mithridates, who faced the difficulties of life as a wise man would. There was a king reigned in the east. There, when kings will sit to feast, they get their fill before they think with poisoned meat and poisoned drink. He gathered all that springs to birth from the many venomed earth. First a little, thence to more, he sampled all her killing store, and easy, smiling, seasoned sound sat the kings when healths went round. They put arsenic in his meat, and stared aghast to watch him eat. They poured strychnine in his cup, and shook to see him drink it up. They shook, they stared as white's their shirt. Them it was their poison hurt. I tell the tale that I heard told. Mithridates, he died old.
Dr. Shepard, could you tell us what the relevance of this anecdote that Terence tells us is?
This anecdote is used as evidence to support the poet's point, saying that if you adjust to the world as it is, then you will be conditioned to accept what happens. You will be able to withstand what happens. If you are going to be conditioned to the world as it's not, then you will be in no position to withstand the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune.
Yes, sir. Another interesting idea that I find in the line, them it was their poison hurt, is the idea that if a man does manage to condition himself so that he can accept his troubles philosophically and not go to pieces and give way to despair, he has, in a sense, risen superior to his misfortunes, just as Mithridates was superior to those who tried to hurt him, and just as they succeeded only in hurting themselves, so a man who can accept troubles philosophically without giving way to despair has triumphed over his misfortunes.
There is also the implication that poetry is a kind of antidote to the poisons of life, which one takes in advance, and that if one takes poetry and reads poetry, when life comes in with great difficulties, he will be able to bear up under them, because the poem can give him the poisons of life a little at a time, so that when difficulties come, he can bear them and then, like Mithridates, die old.